What's up? In Egyptian mythology, when the elites became arrogant and corrupt, causing the population to become depraved, the god Ra sent Sekhme, the goddess of war, the lioness, to punish humanity. This finds a parallel in Hinduism when a demon named Raktabija, who every time he shed drops of blood, more demons were born from that blood. He and these demons brought hell to earth, tormenting the people. The gods then sent Kali to kill this demon and the demons that were derived from him. Both stories are interesting not only because of the similarities between the corruption of corrupt leaders and demons, but also because of the outcome they brought upon themselves. That's because both Sekhme and Kali represent the fury of justice, fury in its rawest form. And they not only devastated these corrupt leaders and these demons, but in the heat of their fury they brought chaos and fear to those leaders and those demons, nearly destroying the world in the process. These two figures, as I said, represent fury, but not gratuitous fury, not fury in the sense of evil, but rather the fury of justice. They should be understood as the equivalent of the physical manifestation of the destructive side of the universe, or as the reaction to the consequences of the actions of bad and corrupt leaders, which is something that most leaders end up forgetting over time, which is the fact that their actions have consequences that over time will get out of their control. One thing I've seen being talked about more and more here in Brazil is how Brazilians are lethargic and still haven't revolted despite so much frustration and injustice. But I personally believe that we are getting closer and closer to the limit. So I don't know if we'll have a sudden rupture like we saw in the French Revolution, or more recently in Nepal, or if it will be something more gradual and slow, undermining the state and society, as in 12th century China. In any case, I see increasingly strong elements in how the country's political, economic, and judicial leadership operates. They are pushing society into a situation that will become too heavy even for them to bear. And the vast, and I say the vast, most of them, even from this elite, don't realize this, thinking they're still in control or that the situation isn't that bad. I personally have already heard from judges and prosecutors I've talked to that they didn't understand why I was giving this warning. After all, everyone who talked to them praised their work, not realizing the fact that most of these people who interact with them do so out of self-interest, flattery, or fear. Some others, connected to politics, I even noticed that they realize the situation is heading toward an explosion. But they have the illusion that when the fire starts, it will be more, or an opportunity for them to emerge as a kind of new leadership by taking advantage of this chaos. And even though it's true that explosive popular movements have only been effective in changing regimes when they were co-opted by political leaders, it's important to keep in mind that these leaders shouldn't be associated with the old regime. That's something the internet nowadays makes much harder for opportunists. Besides, when a situation gets to that point, everything becomes unpredictable. Like Kali and Sekhmet nearly destroying the world while defeating demons and the corrupt. Anyway, I see several elements, and I mean several, even though it suggests there are fewer unless the leaders themselves take a step back. This story can't end well. Not for the people, and not even for the vast majority of these elites who are underestimating the size of the hole they're digging. These waves of fury will repeat themselves in the coming years. It won't just happen in Brazil. We'll see it in England, Germany, France, Russia, several Middle Eastern and African countries, and others. Because there will be many cases. But today I want to focus only on Brazil. And the first part I want to focus on is the fact that Brazilians are not a happy people. That's a myth. Often, when news comes out about some South Korean celebrity or someone in Japan taking their own life, Brazilians rush in with excitement, commenting on how these countries are unhappy. They only study, only work, they have wealth, but they're unhappy. That's why there are so many suicide attempts. And that, in the end, they wouldn't trade Brazil with all its problems and the happiness of the Brazilian people for any of those rich countries. And that's just one more of the other myths that Brazilians have created to justify their passivity, because definitely Brazilians are not a happy people. They're just clueless. The mental health and mortality data challenge this myth. Reports from the World Health Organization show that Brazil is among the global leaders in the number of people who attempt to take their own lives. and it has high rates of mental disorders accompanied by a huge consumption of antidepressants and anxiolytics. These indicators reveal a worrying reality of depression, anxiety, and self-destruction. Brazil today. Brazil ranks 8th in the world in the absolute number of self-destructions. The most recent data, referring to the year 2022, recorded 16,262 self-destructions in Brazil. This is a national mortality rate of 8 per 100,000 people. This is alarming when compared to the previous year, because in 2020 it increased by 11.8% in just 1 year. This rapid increase means that the risk factors related to self-destructive behaviors not only persist, but become even more intense. We're talking about 42 people per day. Different studies and official reports show the same conclusion. The risk of self-destruction in Brazil has been steadily increasing. Between 2000 and 2018, there was an average yearly increase of 1.4%. However, starting in 2014, this trend experienced a sharp acceleration, with the annual growth rate more than doubling to 3.2%. And if you watch the rest of this video, you'll see that 2014 is not a random year. It's the beginning of the turning point of the Brazilian rupture crisis, which I'll explain in detail throughout this video. From 2010 to 2019, annual deaths rose 43%, increasing from 9,454 to 13,523. And more recent analyses covering the period from 2011 to 2022 confirmed the persistence of this trend, with an average annual growth of 3.7 for the general population. However, it must be made clear that these rates had already been steadily increasing since the 2000s. However, what is K? That period, from 2000 to 2010, was one of relative stability and economic growth, indicating the presence of deeper structural factors. Brazil, after 2014, only acted as an accelerator of this. Brazil ranks very differently in international rankings depending on the metric used. And here's the catch. So comparisons with other countries have to be read within a context. Because, when considering the total number of self-destructions, Brazil remains among the nations with the highest records in the world, placing Brazil in 8th place in the global ranking above countries with much larger populations like India and China. This high position in absolute numbers means that Brazil is a global heavyweight in mortality from self-destructions. Now, Brazil's position changes radically when the ranking is based on percentage, on the number per 100,000 inhabitants. In this metric, which adjusts the numbers according to the size of the population, Brazil would actually be in a comfortable spot, in a very low position, ranging from 123rd to 155th in the ranking. And that's the catch. People take numbers in percentage and without context. This apparently favorable position creates the illusion of tranquility and brings the arrogance of being a feminine country. The rate of this type of mortality, which is relatively low, is wrongly used to argue that this is a less urgent problem in Brazil compared to other nations, or with other causes of death in the country itself, such as homicides or traffic accidents. However, this statistical view overlooks the most important indicator, the phenomenon's trajectory. The most crucial and alarming point of comparison is the direction of the trend. And here is where we have the real warning. Because, while the world as a whole has made progress in preventing self-destruction, Brazil is one of the few exceptions, along with other Latin American countries, moving in the opposite direction. Globally, rates have decreased by 36% between 2000 and 2019, but during that same period, the number of cases in Brazil increased by 43%. And if you take the numbers of traffic deaths, deaths by homicide, and deaths by self-destruction, Brazil ends up surpassing by far most of the planet, including those countries that are at war. Brazil then stops being a country and becomes a giant meat grinder. There's no way that anyone even minimally intelligent could think that this is normal and that nothing will ever happen. The group most affected by the growing trend of self-destruction in Brazil are the millennial and Gen Z generations. Between 2011 and 2022, their rate increased by an annual average of 6%, a much faster pace than the 3.7% growth observed in the general population. These two generations have exactly what it takes to explode. And besides these numbers, other mental health indicators show the unhappiness of Brazilians, with estimates indicating that 5.8% of the population suffers from depression and 9.3% live with anxiety disorders. These percentages correspond to about 11.5 million Brazilians with depression and 18.6 million with anxiety. These are among the highest in the world and are the largest in the Americas. In comparison, global depression prevalence is about 4.4% and anxiety is 3.6%, which makes the Brazilian rates much higher than the world average. And this is confirmed by the fact that the use of psychiatric medications has skyrocketed in Brazil in recent decades. A national survey shows that sales of mental health medications increased by more than 30% after the COVID-19 pandemic. Comparing 2019 to 2022, the consumption of antidepressants jumped 34%, sedatives increased by 33%, and anxiolytics grew by 10%. But this upward trend had already started before the pandemic. It is estimated that currently 74% of all psychotropic drugs consumed in the country are antidepressants and 26% are anxiolytics. Brazil is the world's largest consumer of clonazepam, also called Rivotril. So these are numbers that place Brazil among the largest markets for psychotropic drugs in the world. In other words, to be very clear, we don't work as much as the Japanese, we don't study as much as the South Koreans, we don't have the infrastructure or wealth of either of them, but in the end, we're just as unhappy as they are. So, there's nothing to move forward, move forward. Brazilians, contrary to what people say, are not the country of happy people. This talk about Brazilian warmth making people happier is a complete lie. I'm sharing these facts because mental health is linked to civilizational health. The rates of self-destruction show the idea of a civilizational crisis where they increase. Countries or periods marked by turbulent transitions, the breakdown of community ties, or socio-economic stress. Historically, they show an increase in self-inflicted deaths, and there are plenty of examples of this, like in post-Soviet Union Russia and post-2011 financial crisis, Greece as well as in the United States after the 1929 recession. So this is a sentinel indicator. Its high, persistent, or increasing levels should serve as a warning that society may be getting sick at its core. So psychologically, Brazilians are already on the verge of exploding. The problem is that he has, let's say, exploded inward, at least up until now. But there is a large-scale ignition here which shouldn't be ignored and probably will be externalized. Now onto Generation Z. Isn't this supposed to be the largest wealth transfer ever? In this decade and the next, we may witness the largest wealth transferred in history. As the baby boomers, people born roughly from 1946 to 1968 experienced inequality. Is in a state of inequality. A society of inequality. Society is in a state of inequality. Society is in a state of inequality. Society is in inequality. Society is in a situation of inequality. Society is in inequality in a situation of inequality of inequality. Society of inequality. Society in inequality. Society in a situation of inequality. Society in inequality. Society is in a situation of inequality. Because look, between 1950 and 2020, it was the period of greatest creation of material and immaterial wealth in human history. But we have three problems. I've already said how the baby boomer generation essentially ruined the economic future for later generations. Because this generation of wealth between 1950 and 2020, interestingly, has little to do with the skills of the baby boomers, unlike what they believe, but rather with the generations born between 1880 and 1949, who, while they were in leadership positions in their countries, built the infrastructure that the baby boomers inherited and enjoyed. So, the participation of the baby boomers in generating this wealth was very small. They experienced the consequences of what earlier generations had done. And what the baby boomers planted was a colossal increase in state costs, social benefits that will have to be paid by the following generations. And it's not a small thing, alright? Because on top of that, even though they say that the younger people today aren't doing anything to solve the situation, if you look at most of the leaders around the world, you'll see that the baby boomers are still leading the countries. They haven't given up their power, and on top of that, they're blocking reforms because they could be affected by them. If you take the average age of the leaders of any country, you'll see how frighteningly high it is. There are very few people under 60 in decision-making positions, so you can't blame younger people for not trying to make changes, because the ones making the decisions and forcing them are the older ones, the baby boomers. We're talking about deficits that have the potential to consume the entire 21st century. Half-price tickets for seniors, priority service, retirement, funding for all kinds of assistance, all of that requires money. Someone has to work to pay for someone else. With the boomers out of the workforce, it wouldn't be paid by them, but by those who came after. And never before in human history have we seen so many benefits in AIDS. The numbers haven't added up for a few years now, and it's only going to get worse, so this fiscal hole will take a long time to be paid off, which is the first problem of overall indebtedness, but a second problem has been exploding among the middle classes. It's not just in Brazil, but here what interests us is Brazil, so we're going to talk about the Brazilian case. What philosophy supports "I'm not leaving anything for my children"? Throughout most of history, building and passing on wealth was central to the family's social contract. Land, herds, houses, knowledge, or businesses were legacies not just to enrich the descendants, but to ensure the continuity of the family name. With the post-World War second boom and with accelerated economic growth and access to cheap credit, this allowed the boomer generation to accumulate real estate, savings, and retirement plans on a scale never seen before. In other words, they inherited an expanding world, very different from today, which will basically focus on paying off the credit they created. Among middle-class boomers, especially in Brazil, this logic emerged. They've already given their children an education and now they want to enjoy their own lives. This is reinforced by the rhetoric of coaches and digital influencers who encourage the individual freedom to spend money guilt-free and enjoy old age. It's almost the opposite of the traditional ethos. Life isn't about leaving material legacies, but about consuming experiences until the end. The irony is that this view ignores the fact that structural conditions have changed, with public debt, asset inflation like real estate, the stock market, and stagnant wages. Millennials and Generation Z have much less chance of building wealth comparable to what the boomers had. For them, inheritance is a crucial factor for mobility, and if denied, it deepens the generational gap. And, interestingly, the boomer middle classes who have adopted this lifestyle of spending all their wealth without leaving an inheritance end up leaving nothing. They are encouraged by these coaches and influencers who are already wealthy and who, ironically, while telling the middle class to do this, the very rich are doing the opposite, leaving wealth to their descendants to create a family legacy. Basically, these very wealthy influencers are preaching liberalism for your family, but conservatism for theirs. Which brings us now to the third problem, because just now that this wealth transfer is about to happen, assuming your parents thought about leaving you something, then comes the government. The new Imposto de Transmissão, Causa Mortis e Doação rules will have complex effects on the younger generations. Many of these young people don't even expect to receive any significant inheritance. Low savings rates, high education and housing costs, and high debts mean that many people don't count on inherited wealth. Most transferred wealth will go to the very rich, so only those from wealthy families will benefit significantly, because they can afford to absorb the costs of taxes. On the other hand, the lower classes, who already have their power reduced by inequalities, would theoretically be benefited. Because of the progressive tax, which would protect these small inheritances from taxation. It would be wonderful if it weren't for the fact that someone has to pay the bill, and this bill from the poorest will fall on the middle class. In other words, the middle class will have to cover the costs so that the poor don't have to pay for it. Meanwhile, the very rich will be able to handle the losses because they can manipulate the system in their favor. And if you follow the channel, you saw the video about how a series of new taxes will dramatically increase the cost of maintaining properties. Among the few families who will inherit some property, we'll also see many of them selling that inheritance just to pay the taxes. In other words, you won't have anything, you'll hardly build anything, and you won't inherit anything either. This is a very deep social and cultural rift that is directly affecting the psychology of younger people. I'm not just referring to very young people. The younger you are, the worse it gets. What I just said explains why the younger generations are so apathetic and hopeless about any positive future. What I hear the most from people under 30 is, "Who cares? I'm never going to be able to retire anyway." So there's no hope and no expectation, and building wealth in the coming decades will be a luxury. What was supposed to be the greatest transfer of wealth in history will become the greatest confiscation in history, and as a result, the greatest frustration ever seen. And this large-scale frustration can only translate in one way: rage. This link between the economy and collective psychology is real. The loss of perspective will generate social nihilism. This rupture has devastating effects on the collective psyche of the younger generations. What was once seen as a horizon in the future, the chance to build something, or at least inherit a minimal foundation, even if remote, existed. But it became a desert of expectations. With no assets, no inheritance, and facing a fragile but greedy state that promises everything free if you give up all you have. Millennials and Generation Z internalize the feeling that any effort is useless. Then a general apathy arises, the abandonment of believing in the future or making long-term plans. The biggest risk isn't just economic, it's civilizational, as a whole generation losing faith in the future. The pact that sustains the social order breaks, paving the way for radicalism, political ruptures, and social explosions that could mark the 21st century. Which brings us then to part 3, which is the excess of laws. If you follow the channel, you might have seen this video on what causes civilizations to collapse. Several reasons tend to accumulate until reaching a breaking point, though the issues differ between civilizations. There are many varieties, but practically only one is constant and keeps repeating, which is the excess of laws. Civilizations near collapse share one trait: too many laws. While more laws seem to bring order, they actually do the opposite. An excess of laws and social regulations not only makes it harder for society to innovate and respond efficiently to crises, but more than that, it also overloads the state itself. The state grows so large it becomes obese and loses mobility. Instead of the state ensuring the enforcement and functioning of a minimum set of laws, it becomes overloaded, and its ability to supervise and enforce, making it obviously unable to take care of everything, because it's impossible. And as a result, the authorities connected to the state then decide which laws to enforce according to the context. Usually, this context is used to persecute groups considered to be opponents or troublesome. On a superficial level, it's like saying that since everyone is breaking the law, I get to choose whom to punish according to my own convenience. That's exactly what we're seeing in Brazil. Since the 1988 Constitution, Brazil has accumulated an extraordinary volume of rules. A study by IBPT indicates that between 1988 and 2024, about 7 or 8 million regulations were issued, or around 860 new regulations per business day. To give you an idea in tax matters, more than 400,000 rules have already been published, or 2.14 per working hour. This legislative avalanche creates a legal maze. Most citizens and even managers don't know which regulations are in effect, which makes business difficult and encourages informality. In addition, Brazil has per capita litigation rates that are unparalleled. In 2022, for example, there were about 81.4 million pending cases with 40,078 cases per 100,000 inhabitants, compared to 5,800 in the United States and 12,300 in Germany. Currently, 31.5 million new cases are filed, which is 10% higher than in 2021. Over 78 million lawsuits were filed in 2021 and 2022. These colossal numbers reflect an overburdened judiciary with an average duration of 2 years and 7 months in the common courts, which could even be seen as a problem for them. Actually, it's a chance for the judiciary to justify being the world's most expensive. And the trend is only getting worse, because on one hand, Brazilians have a fetish for laws. Most people I hear say there should be a law for this or that. And on the other hand, what is considered a good lawmaker is the one who introduces the most bills. This creates unstable politicians, because they tend to pass a lot of regulations just to pretend they're working, even if those laws are of questionable quality. The surplus of laws quickly turns into complexity and contradictions. Too many laws reduce bureaucratic efficiency, creating a vicious cycle where each poorly implemented reform generates more inconsistent rules. And poorly written laws full of cross-references increase uncertainty and the cost of making economic decisions. Individuals and companies then tend to litigate instead of taking risks, since the judiciary becomes the arena where the real rules are defined. The fact that civilizations nearing their collapse have more laws is no coincidence. It's a symptom that signals the lifespan of that society. The weaker institutions become, the more laws are stacked up as crutches, but each new rule only increases confusion and insecurity. Months ago I made a video explaining how the state is destroying social relations. Actually, the video caused me the most headaches, because even though I showed that it's the state that's breaking social relations by bureaucratizing and interfering too much in people's lives, a lot of people didn't understand. Women got mad at me and men got mad at the women. Both sides ignored the true cause of mutual distrust, the state whose excessive laws complicate social relations. Which leads us to part 4. Living in Brazil is becoming nearly impossible. If you follow the channel, you probably saw the video about the new taxes that the federal government, the states, and the municipalities will introduce as early as 2026. The worst of all is related to the issue of real estate. New taxes, new interpretations of laws, and adjustments to property taxes have the potential to raise the cost of housing to an unprecedented level in the country. And believe me, there are people who support this, saying that after all, Brazil pays little property tax compared to European countries. We're talking about rents becoming 2, 3, or even 4 times more expensive in just a 3-year period. Look, even if they strictly follow these new measures, and even if they don't, any increase is already absurdly small and harmful to the cost of living in Brazil, which is already becoming ridiculously high. Even taxes on people who live rent-free could end up being charged with retroactive fines and at a sky-high scale. If you raise the price of where you live or stay, you automatically raise the price of everything. Brazil's gross tax burden has hovered around 32% to 33% of gross domestic product in recent years, which is extremely high for its per capita income. We can't categorically say that we've surpassed the Laffer curve because it's difficult to demonstrate that empirically, but we have sectoral risks of revenue peaks and narrow base effects. However, Peter Turchin, whom I've already mentioned here on the channel, proves that major revolts, which often lead to national collapses, are also linked to food prices. Collapses are the result of multifactorial accumulation with delays, like a cup that overflows. People tend to look only at the last drop of water as being responsible, ignoring all the water that was already in the cup, which is a mistake. And in the Brazilian case, we even have a fairly recent reference to compare, like a sort of rehearsal for what's to come, which was the impeachment that led to the fall of Dilma Rousseff in 2016. That was the result of an equation that started way back in 2011. First, with globally more expensive food starting in 2008, but that began to put pressure on the population here in Brazil. Actually, cost and expectation pressure only began in 2011. Then, with urban fares rising, which was the trigger in 2013, the 20 cents increase in bus fares. It later expanded to include corruption, public services, and opposition to World Cup and Olympics mega events. And by the way, it's worth remembering that this crisis was led by the then mayor of São Paulo, Haddad, and the then governor, Alckmin, who today hold positions in the federal government. Later, Operation Car Wash further undermined political legitimacy and made things more apparent. Most people already knew the PT is a criminal organization, but this was ignored even though it should be taken seriously. Severe water stress had been building since 2011 and peaked in 2014 and 2015 in São Paulo state, especially Greater São Paulo, affecting the cost of living and the mood, the collective psychology of the population. And since São Paulo is not only the richest metropolitan area, but mainly the largest concentrated population in the country, having alone about 10% of the population, everything that happens in São Paulo inevitably spreads and affects the rest of the country. So there was no other possible outcome in 2016 except for the fall of Dilma's government. All of this is like drops adding up before the overflow. And again now, in 2025 I see similar signs. Which brings us back to the original question, why hasn't the Brazilian, despite all this, still not rebelled violently? There isn't just one type of civilizational collapse. Which brings us then to the conclusion, the Brazilian rebellion. Basically, we have three possible outcomes from this equation. And this won't apply only to Brazil, as I said at the beginning of the video, but in many, and I mean many countries, even around the world. The first is the ideal scenario, where leaders, realizing the imminent rupture, decide to give up power. Like a pressure cooker, you release pressure gradually to prevent an explosion. A social situation like this can also be gradually depressurized, although not too slowly because it needs to be something noticeable and tangible for the population. A lot of people think that leaders never give up power, but that's not really true. We have many historical precedents where leaders gave up power precisely to maintain that power. But one of the most successful and more recent cases which interests us is China. In the post-Civil War period, within a span of 25 years, the Chinese found themselves in at least one war with each of their neighbors. Technological stagnation, looming economic collapse, and ideological disasters like the Cultural Revolution and Great Leap Forward. It was clear that the Maoist Marxist model couldn't work. So what they did was a gradual and controlled social and economic pressure relief. It started in the last days of Mao Zedong's life, but was actually led by the genius of Deng Xiaoping and maintained in the following decades by the leaders who came after. If you think that today's China is even remotely similar to the Maoist period, rethink your existence and everything you think you know, because they are definitely two different countries. The Communist Party remained communist only in name because in practice it adopted a very aggressive and hyper-competitive capitalism, being even freer than many Western countries that are called capitalist. So basically, they gave up power in order to achieve even greater power in the long run. It's like gangrene. The doctor amputates the dead part to preserve the rest of the body. And just like gangrene, this strategy only works if the leaders notice the risk early, before it spreads to the rest of the body. But if we don't see this first scenario of leaders giving in, then we have the two worst scenarios. In the second scenario, a quick and overwhelming rupture, like we saw in Nepal or during the French Revolution, institutions and leaders once seen as strong will fall at a surprisingly rapid pace. Places where the once unthinkable will simply happen. It's sudden because it's like a heart attack, a cardiac arrest. This sudden collapse is how most people think civilizational collapses happen. She went to sleep Sunday night and woke up to a chaotic Monday as if the world were ending. I'm sorry. That's actually not a very common type, because we have the third scenario, the slow, agonizing, and gradual death, as also happened in China in the 19th and early 20th centuries. After the Opium Wars, China kept weakening and fading year after year, with military leaders taking regional control, answering to central authority only when it was convenient. During this period, there was also the colossal rise of drug trafficking and organized crime. At the same time that wars from religious extremists and foreign invasions were still erupting, small pockets of power began to emerge in a scattered and widespread way throughout the country, slowly killing the nation. Few like a kind of cancer affecting various parts of the patient. Which of these three scenarios will be Brazil's scenario? I don't know, but I think the first hypothesis is the one of giving up power. Very unlikely. Because political and judicial leaders think that everything is under control and that the situation isn't that bad. Most likely this is due to the Brasilia effect, by physically and geographically isolating the capital from the rest of the country, which is the true purpose of building this city. It made them have no idea how deep a hole they dug for themselves. And if we haven't seen angry crowds yet, it's because of the lack of a phenomenon called the herd effect, but I think it could happen at any moment. Which is a phenomenon in social psychology where people follow the behavior and opinions of a larger group, even if that means ignoring their own beliefs or facts, which can lead to impulsive and sometimes irrational decisions. It's overwhelming and explosive, not planned. In Brazil, there are precedents. In 2013, the Haddad administration announced a 20-cent fare increase. It was a relatively small group protesting in front of the city hall. Until one day, when they went to protest on Paulista Avenue, the military police literally decided to crack down. They beat up everyone, and I mean literally everyone, especially those uninvolved in the protests. They went into restaurants and bars looking for protesters and grabbed people who didn't even know what was going on. They fired rubber bullets at residents in the area who were filming with their cell phones. They stopped passing buses and searched people who were just returning to work and didn't even know about any protest. And in just a few hours, the protests by a handful of insignificant students grew, with people rising up against police violence. Pretty much everyone in the area got swept up in it. Things then got out of control and repeated over the following days, bringing together people with all kinds of causes, and it wasn't just about the 20 cents anymore. There was no other way. Haddad and Alckmin over time had to give in, and that paved the way for many protests that came afterward and ended up affecting Dilma's government. In 2016, when you already know the outcome, so it's very likely that all that's missing is that last straw. Even so, as I said, there's the third scenario, a slow, gradual death. If it exists, one thing that you can definitely see is the fact that the biggest cost of living bill, more crime, demographic crisis, and increased state tyranny can't keep growing for much longer. Without this causing a rupture, this lethargy and passivity of the population is hiding something very sinister underneath it. In the last days of the end of the Roman Empire, the Roman elites knew that the imperial machine was rotting. Inflation, corruption, external pressures from the barbarians, agricultural decline. Many authors of that time wrote warnings about how the situation could explode at any moment. But instead of reacting, they held banquets, power struggles, internal disputes, lethargy. And when the Visigoths entered Rome in 410, much of the Roman elite still believed that it was just a passing turbulence. The price was their destruction. In 19th century China, the Qin Empire watched helplessly as the West dominated after the Opium Wars. There were clear-minded ministers who warned the nobility about the dangers of drug dependence and European technological superiority. But the court believed the Middle Kingdom would always be superior. This inertia resulted in humiliations, unequal treaties, and the loss of Hong Kong. Passivity in the face of a tsunami opened the door to a century of foreign domination and the end of the dynastic period. In France, before the 1789 revolution, the financial collapse was known by everyone. The monarchy was neck-deep in debt. Famine plagued the peasants. Pamphlets circulated denouncing the privileges of the nobility, and the elite discussed fashion, held balls, and spent fortunes at Versailles. When popular fury erupted, it was violent and irreversible. The tsunami of the revolution did not come as a surprise. It was ignored. In today's Brazil, we have a similar scenario. Demographic imbalance, failing education, declining mental health, and an overgrown state are obvious. The signs are glaring and the statistics are transparent. Still, the masses are numbed by soap operas and social media, and the political elite pretends to govern, while only prolonging their own survival at the cost of the very existence of the state that protects them. In other words, they are corroding what protects them. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Share the video with everyone you know to help the World Geopolitics channel keep growing and, most importantly, keep existing. Hugs, see you next video.